Have you ever looked at the person you love and wondered, when did we start feeling like strangers? It's terrifying how love can fade quietly, the way winter light disappears in Denmark. Slow, cold, and unnoticed. In this video, I'll tell you the story of how my parents' quiet legacy of love pulled me back from giving up on my own marriage, and how a single moment in the Danish winter reminded me what kind of love I was raised to carry. Winter question of the heart. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a Danish winter afternoon. The kind where the sky looks like someone spread a thin layer of cold chalk over the whole world. The wind keeps slapping your face as if it's personally offended that you're still trying your best in life. And in that chilly quiet, one question rises in your mind, one you've avoided for months. Am I still loving the right way? Denmark gives you too much time to think. The sun disappears early, the streets are calm, and your mind, well, it becomes the loudest thing in the room. I still remember that moment as if it's frozen in my bones. I was standing by the window of our small apartment in Aarhus, looking at the perfectly parked bicycles down below when it hit me. I had no idea where my marriage was heading. The scary part wasn't that I loved less. It was that I couldn't feel anything clearly. Your brain has a funny habit. It hates uncertainty. It wants emotions in bold font. Love that sparkles, sadness that makes you cry, joy that dances. But marriage doesn't work like that. Marriage is shades of gray. Some warm, some icy, some confusing enough to make you question everything you thought you knew. Science calls it emotional flattening, a state where your feelings blur out under low sunlight and long-term stress. In simple terms, your nervous system goes into battery-saving mode, trimming emotions just to keep you running. And when that happens, doubt crawls in. Does the person you love still understand you? Are you becoming a burden? Or worse, are you slowly turning into someone who might walk away simply because they are exhausted? Ironically, that moment of emotional fog made me think about my parents. Two ordinary people who built a life not with grand speeches but with small, steady gestures. Cups of tea, shared silence, bruised hands from hard work, and a kind of love that didn't need to be loud to be real. I suddenly wondered, how did they keep that love alive for so many years? What secret strength did they have that I didn't? That thought pulled me back from the emotional edge. It made me realize something both funny and painfully true. Sometimes you have to move across the world, stand in the freezing Danish wind, and almost lose yourself, just to discover that you've been carrying a quiet legacy of love all along, and that cracked, trembling question, am I still loving the right way? Was the beginning of everything I'm about to share. What my parents taught without words. Here's a strange truth about childhood. You rarely notice the lessons that shape you until life tests you in a place far from home. It wasn't until I was living in Denmark, where silence is practically a national language, that I realized my parents had taught me most of what I know about love without ever giving a single life lecture. They weren't philosophers. They weren't experts. They were just two people who showed love the way people breathe, quietly, consistently, without needing applause. When you grow up in a house like that, your brain makes an odd mistake. It assumes love is simple. It assumes connection is automatic. It assumes warmth is something the world naturally provides, like tap water. But then you move to a place where winter feels like it's testing your emotional Wi-Fi, and suddenly you understand, Everything you thought was normal was actually a gift. I remember watching my parents while growing up. My father fixing something around the house at 10 p.m. because it'll bother your mother tomorrow. Or my mother slipping an extra piece of fruit into his lunchbox even when they were arguing the night before. They didn't articulate their love. They acted it out, one unremarkable gesture at a time. Psychologists call this implicit modeling, when children learn more from what parents do than what they say. And I had absorbed all of it like a silent language, but here's the punchline. Knowing that language doesn't mean you always remember how to speak it. The distance, the stress, the cold, the unspoken pressures of building a life in a foreign country, they can blur everything. Suddenly you find yourself reacting, snapping, withdrawing, forgetting the softness you were raised with. It's like your emotional software glitches under unfamiliar weather. And there I was standing in the middle of our living room in Denmark, feeling like I had misplaced the very love style my parents spent decades demonstrating, so I started replaying their lessons in my mind. Not the big ones, because honestly they never gave those. I remembered the small ones, the way my father always paused before responding, the way my mother always reached out first after a disagreement, the way they stayed even when staying was hard. Those memories felt like tiny matches striking in the dark. And that's when it clicked. The legacy they gave me wasn't advice. It was capacity, the capacity to love gently, to stay steady, to try again even when your heart feels tired. I realized I hadn't lost their lessons. I had simply stopped noticing them. When marriage felt heavy, there's a peculiar moment in marriage that no one warns you about. The moment when love doesn't disappear, but it feels heavier than it should. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just weighty. Like carrying a backpack you didn't realize was full of tiny stones until one day your shoulders ache. That moment hit me in Denmark on a gray Tuesday that looked exactly like every other gray Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. You know those days when conversations feel like they've been dipped in cold water? When every word between you and the person you love feels slightly delayed, slightly off, like a video buffering at the worst possible moment. That was us. We weren't fighting. We weren't drifting apart in the obvious ways. We were simply misaligned. Two people sitting at the same table, sharing the same soup, but feeling miles apart. Science has a name for this too. Emotional load incongruence. It sounds fancy, but it basically means one person is carrying stress the other person can't see. And both end up confused about why everything suddenly feels harder. In my case, it was the quiet exhaustion of adapting to a new country, the hidden loneliness of living far from family, and the constant effort of learning to build a life in a place that didn't feel like mine yet. And like most people, I didn't realize I had brought all that weight into my marriage. My partner once asked, "Are you okay?" And I remember answering, "I'm just tired." But that wasn't true. I was overwhelmed. I was homesick. I was silently grieving the life I used to understand. And when you carry emotions you don't name, the person you love ends up carrying the confusion for you. It's unfair but painfully human. One evening, we were washing dishes. Nothing cinematic, no dramatic rainstorm outside, no swelling music in the background. Just two tired people standing in a small Danish kitchen. I handed him a plate and he said, "You feel far away lately." Not accusing, not angry, just honest. And somehow that honesty hurt more than anger ever could, that I didn't know how to explain the hollowness I felt. How do you tell someone, "I love you, but right now everything feels muted and I don't know why"? My brain wanted to fix it instantly, but my heart didn't have the words. So I did what stressed humans do, I shut down. Not fully. Just enough for the silence between us to start growing roots. Looking back, I think that was the first time I truly understood how fragile connection can feel when life gets heavy. Love doesn't vanish. It just gets buried under the noise of survival. And once it's buried, even simple moments become harder to navigate. But here's the twist. The heaviness wasn't a sign something was breaking. It was a sign something inside me needed attention, needed gentleness, needed remembering. And that remembering was about to come from the last place I expected. A quiet memory of my father. My father's quiet kind of love. Strange how the mind works. You can be thousands of kilometers from home, surrounded by Danish architecture and icy winds, and suddenly a tiny memory from childhood walks in like it owns the place. That happened to me one night when marriage felt complicated and my emotions were tangled like earbuds in a pocket. Out of nowhere, I remembered my father. Not a big moment. Not some heroic story. Just him, sitting at our kitchen table back home, fixing a broken chair leg with the kind of patience only people who love deeply seem to possess. My father wasn't a loud man. He didn't give speeches about love or life or responsibility. But he had this way of showing up, quietly, consistently, almost invisibly. Like gravity. Always there whether you noticed or not. And that night in Denmark, when I felt myself withdrawing from the person I loved, I suddenly understood something my father never said out loud. Love isn't loud, it's reliable. Growing up, I used to think his silence meant he didn't feel things as deeply as my mother did. But adulthood reveals your parents in a completely different light. You begin to understand the weight they carried, the sacrifices they made, and the emotional storms they walked through without letting you see. My father loved with actions, not adjectives. He showed care through the way he listened. Fully, patiently, without interrupting. He offered safety not through promises but through presence. Psychologists call this secure attachment modeling. When a child learns emotional stability simply by observing a caregiver who remains steady even during conflict. I didn't know that term back then, but I felt the effect of it years later in that Danish apartment when my marriage felt strained. My nervous system, stressed and confused, was craving the very thing my father embodied. Calm consistency. So I replayed one specific memory. I must have been 9. I had broken something precious, one of my mother's favorite bowls, and I stood there terrified, waiting for him to be angry. But he didn't shout. He didn't sigh. He simply picked up the pieces, handed me the biggest one and said, "Hold this for me. We'll fix it together." No drama. No guilt. Just teamwork. And suddenly, standing in my adult kitchen halfway across the world, that memory hit me like warm light. Love is fixing things together, not assigning blame. Love is staying calm when things break. Love is choosing softness even when you're tired. I realized I had forgotten that part of myself, the part shaped by him. I had let stress replace patience, let loneliness replace understanding, let cold weather replace warmth. But my father had given me a blueprint for love long before I needed it. And that blueprint was about to lead me back to my mother's gentle kind of strength, the other half of the legacy I carried. My mother's soft strength. There's a specific kind of strength that doesn't look like strength at all. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand space, it doesn't break through walls. It simply stays. My mother had that kind of strength, quiet, warm, persistent in a way that felt almost unreasonable. And I didn't realize how powerful it was until the night I nearly gave up trying to explain my heart to the person I loved. Funny thing about love, you think the loud moments are the ones that matter, big fights, big apologies, dramatic breakthroughs. But the real glue, the thing that holds two people together, is usually the smallest action repeated consistently. My mother was a master of this. Not because she studied psychology or read self-help books, but because she understood something most people learn only after heartbreak. Love doesn't need to be intense. It needs to be steady. Point one, memory comes back to me like a soft whisper. I must have been 15, sulking in my room over something that felt life-shattering at the time. Probably a bad grade or a teenage argument. My mother didn't lecture me. She didn't ask for explanations. She just knocked once, walked in with a small bowl of warm soup, set it on my desk and said, "Eat a little. Everything feels better when your heart isn't hungry." Then she left. That moment made no sense to me back then. Now, feels like emotional genius. Research actually backs her up. When people are overwhelmed, the brain's emotional center becomes underfueled, and simple sensory comforts like warmth and nourishment help stabilize the nervous system. My mother didn't know the science, she just understood humans. And one evening in Denmark, when my marriage felt like a language I suddenly couldn't speak, I remembered that bowl of soup. Not the taste, just the message behind it. Care first. Words later. So instead of trying to explain my tangled emotions, something I'd been failing at for weeks, I did something small. My partner was working late, exhausted from the day, and I made a cup of tea the way he likes it. Not as a grand gesture, just as my mother would. Warmth first. Conversation later. When he walked in, he looked surprised. Not at the tea, but at the softness. You'd be amazed how quickly emotional distance shrinks when one person chooses warmth instead of defensiveness. He sat down. I sat across from him. And for the first time in a long time, the silence between us didn't feel like a wall. It felt like an invitation. And why Mother taught me that strength isn't pushing through conflict. It's reaching out gently when everything in you wants to pull away. It's staying present even when your heart feels bruised. It's choosing connection over pride. And that soft strength became the bridge that led us back to each other. One cup of tea at a time. A small victory in the Danish wind. There's something almost comical about how life gives you breakthroughs at the most unglamorous moments. Not during a romantic dinner, not during a deep midnight talk, no. Mine happened outside a supermarket in Denmark, with my hair being violently rearranged by the wind, and my shopping bag threatening to fly away like a runaway balloon. If you've ever experienced Danish wind, you know it isn't wind. It's a personality with anger issues. I had just stepped outside Fotex when it happened. My partner and I were walking home together, bundled up like two confused penguins, when a small moment shifted everything. He reached for my hand, not dramatically, not with some cinematic pause, just naturally, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And for the first time in months, my body didn't tense. It softened. My heart didn't panic. It opened, and that softness, tiny, fleeting, almost ridiculous, felt like victory. Scientists would call this a regulation synchrony, a moment when two nervous systems match each other's calm. But honestly, it just felt like love remembering itself. The walk was short, maybe 10 minutes, but something was different. Our steps felt in rhythm again. Not perfect, not magical, just in rhythm. And suddenly I realized, this is the legacy my parents gave me. Not a perfect marriage, not an instruction manual, not dramatic wisdom carved into stone. They gave me the ability to repair, the ability to stay even when you're tired, the ability to soften even when you feel misunderstood, the ability to reach back when someone reaches out. I thought love had to be grand, huge gestures, big conversations, emotional fireworks. But in that windy Danish moment, I learned something embarrassingly simple and beautifully profound. Love survives through micro moments. Not the big ones, the tiny ones, the almost invisible ones. That we didn't solve everything that day. We didn't unpack all our emotions or magically fix every crack. What we had was just one warm thread weaving its way back between us. And sometimes that's all a relationship needs. A thread to follow back to each other. As we reached our apartment door, cheeks red from the cold, my partner squeezed my hand once. Not a question, not a statement, just a quiet check-in. And I squeezed back. That was our entire conversation. 2 gestures. Less than a second. But emotionally, it felt like a sunrise after a long winter. It hit me then. The love I grew up with wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, wasn't perfect. But it was steady. And that steadiness was finally resurfacing in my own story. A tiny victory in the wind, but a victory nonetheless. Learning to love with intention. After that small victory in the Danish wind, I realized love doesn't just happen. It's practiced. It's intentional. You can't expect that every moment of a long-term relationship will feel like fireworks. Most of the time, it's about consistent, conscious actions, repeated quietly over days, weeks, and years. And that's exactly what my parents had modeled for me. Long before I even understood what marriage meant, I started paying attention to the little things. Not grand gestures or perfect sentences, but micro actions. Asking how my partner's day really went. Sharing a warm cup of tea. Leaving a note with a smiley face tucked in a coat pocket. Felt almost silly at first. This is it, I thought. But then something remarkable happened. These tiny, intentional moments started to build emotional momentum. Our conversations became easier. Our silences felt safe. And slowly, the heavy weight that had lingered over us began to lift. Psychologists would say this is behavioral activation in relationships. A method where repeated positive interactions strengthen bonds and create a feedback loop of trust and connection. Science, yes, but it also feels like magic when you live it. Every small gesture reminded me, love isn't spontaneous sparks. It's choice again and again. I also revisited the lessons from my parents, not as abstract principles, but as living tools. My father's quiet steadiness taught me patience. My mother's gentle softness taught me empathy. I realized I was allowed to carry these traits into my own marriage, adapting them to our quirks, our culture, and even the icy Danish winters. I didn't have to reinvent love. I just had to remember it and act on it consciously every day. And slowly, step by step, day by day, we rebuilt our connection. Not with dramatic declarations or instant transformations, but with countless micro-moments where care, attentiveness, and understanding quietly took root. By practicing love intentionally, I found that even the heaviest days didn't feel unbearable. Even when the world outside felt cold or distant, the warmth we cultivated inside could sustain us. I realized, finally, that the legacy my parents gave me was not about perfection, or grand advice, or heroic gestures. It was about capacity, the ability to love steadily, to repair gently, to persist quietly. And learning to use that capacity intentionally was the most empowering lesson of all. Through these small intentional acts, I began to see that love, like life, grows when it is nurtured consistently, not when it is waited for passively. The legacy I carry forward. Standing in our Copenhagen apartment, watching the soft evening light spill across the wooden floors, I finally understood what my parents had quietly given me. A legacy of love that doesn't rely on perfection, drama, or constant affirmation. It's the kind of love that persists through wind, silence, and small misunderstandings. It's patient. It's gentle. It's intentional. And most importantly, it's ours to carry forward, in every choice, every gesture, every whispered "I'm here," to the people we cherish. Reflecting on our journey, I see now that marriage isn't a single grand moment. It's an accumulation of countless small ones, informed by the examples we inherit from family. My father's steadfastness and my mother's gentle care taught me more than any book or advice ever could. They handed me the tools to navigate emotional storms, to soften instead of snap, to reach out instead of withdraw. And when I applied those lessons even halfway across the world, I found that love could be rebuilt, strengthened, and deepened in ways I had never anticipated. It wasn't instant. It wasn't magical. It was deliberate. Every cup of tea shared, every hand held, every patient listening moment became a thread in the fabric of our renewed connection. I realized that the love I had longed for, the kind that felt steady and warm even on the coldest days, had been inside me all along. My parents' quiet legacy was not just something I remembered. It was alive in my actions, in the choices I made daily. As I look back on that journey, from the gray winter afternoons when doubt loomed, to the small victories in the Danish wind, I feel immense gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons my parents passed down, for the moments that challenged me, and for the opportunity to practice love with intention. And I know now that the greatest gift anyone can leave is not words, Not advice, not material things, but the capacity to love fully and wisely is so. Whenever you feel that heaviness in your relationships, whenever connection seems distant or fragile, remember, the legacy of love you carry, whether inherited or earned, is stronger than you think. Apply it gently, persistently, intentionally, and watch how it transforms even the coldest, most challenging moments into warmth, understanding, and enduring connection.